Hello, I'm Peter Gourevitch. This is Philip Gourevitch. Philip is my cousin, even though we pronounce our names differently. His pronunciation is more accurate to the Russian origins of our name. Enough on that. Philip, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I'm here to talk to you about your book, Standard Operating Procedure, which is about Abu Ghraib prison, famous, infamous, one would say. So let's start out talking about what compelled you to write that book. What was interesting to you about that topic?
Well, I was, to back up a tiny bit, 4 years ago when the photographs of American soldiers abusing Iraqi prisoners in Saddam Hussein's old torture chambers at Abu Ghraib prison, because this prison had been the centerpiece of Saddam's reign of repression. These photographs were released here. They came out on 60 Minutes in the New Yorker. And I was, at the time, covering the presidential election, the 2004 race for the New Yorker. And I assumed that they would become a major occasion for national debate. It was clear at the time that although there were aspects of personal excess and strange group dynamics depicted in these photographs with some of the soldiers posing next to the prisoners, that a lot of what you saw in those prisoners, the use of dogs to make them afraid and to attack them when they were chained to their cages naked, the keeping of prisoners naked, hooded, and long periods in isolation, that these were matters of national policy. The administration quickly tried to make that sound like a partisan position, but here was The Economist magazine, a magazine that supported the invasion of Iraq and many aspects of it as the invasion went on, saying Rumsfeld resign on its cover, making the clear connection between the highest levels of the American government and the actions of these lowest level soldiers as a matter of policy. And it seemed to me that in an election where the president who had started the war was up for re-election, and where the war at that point was not going quite according to plan, and it was clear that whatever the war had been about in the first place, it was now about the fact that we were there. And it was about America's projection of its image and its force into the world. And why was this the image that we wanted to project? Why, after several centuries of American identity being wrapped up in the idea that this is the one thing we don't do as a matter of policy, is to torture, that this is something that does distinguish us, that this is something that attracts the rest of the world to us even as we struggle with it to assert our values or so. Why were we reversing these things? Is this who we want to be? Never happened. And then in the aftermath of the release of the photographs, there was a kind of remarkable and very steady flood of documents from people in government who had been on the losing side of the debate against torture. They had been against it, and they had watched the administration make this the policy of our nation. And they started to leak documents more and more to the press, and you started to be able to see in numerous reports through this rather legalistic paperwork how it had come to be this way. And yet that story, in a strange way, didn't include us. It didn't involve us. It didn't connect us. And it felt always abstract and distant.
To us, you mean the American public? And
yeah, it was very hard to kind of feel a connection between these very abstract legal papers where people are arguing about the exact definition of torture and the exact limitations of pain and so forth, and the experience of this war, which so few Americans, in fact, have a direct involvement in. And then Errol Morris, whom I'd known for years, the filmmaker, started sending me transcripts of interviews he was conducting with the people who took and appeared in these photographs. This was about summer of 2006. And immediately I heard a sound of American soldiers' voices speaking directly about their experience, describing the experience at the prison in ways that nothing in the photographs had led me to anticipate, making me rethink a lot and to feel it more directly, to see them as figures both of our national drama, and also to see how unheard and unseen they had in fact been, and how poorly we understood it. And I felt this I can work with.
Well, we'll say more just about that, about this gap between how we respond to the photos and what you were experiencing and listening to the voices of these people. I mean, we have this idea that photos, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And your book is about the tension between that. The words aren't really what the pictures seem to say. So tell us more about what you were hearing from their words that you're not seeing in the pictures.
I've always felt that a picture is only worth 1,000 inarticulate words. A picture tells you that something happened. It doesn't necessarily tell you what. You don't know what the relationship was between the photographer and the subject. You don't know if the picture was posed or not just by looking at it. Sometimes it seems fairly obvious in a fashion photograph, but you can't always tell. You can't tell anything except that essentially I see a photograph as a piece of evidence. The way that you would say, here's a bloody sock, or here is a fired gun. But we don't know, is this the gun that killed that man, even though it was found lying near him? Or is that the gun that man threw aside? Right, so what it is evidence, we all know, is something that invites an investigator to look more closely and to dig in and find out, what am I looking at? That's what a photograph should be when it comes to you as evidence. These photographs were different from almost all the other kinds of photographs we have that define the major historical events of our times to us, iconic photographs, if you will. They weren't taken by professional photographers. They weren't taken by journalists. If a journalist had taken these pictures, they would have got a Pulitzer Prize or it would have been considered one of the great scoops of our times. But the whole point is they couldn't have. These were things that were being done in secret. And so the photographs offered us, in a sense, an expose, but was it intended? How were they intended? What were they meant to do? They told us, perhaps, that the people who took them were extremely stupid and depraved because they did something self-incriminating. Or they told us that perhaps they didn't think it was strictly self-incriminating. Perhaps it reflected that they thought it had become normal. Perhaps it reflected some sense of unease with what they were seeing, the way that soldiers often take photographs of a corpse by the roadside or of scenes of battle as a record, as a kind of visual war story. And so it became clear to me that part of the story of Abu Ghraib was that we saw something incredibly powerful, something that compromised the national honor and made us question what we were doing. And at the same time, we weren't entirely sure what we were looking at. And even an aspect of it that struck me was, these are amateur photographs, and they're blurry and hard to read as stories. And this is an amateur-run war where it's incompetently executed and it's unclear what's happening and we don't even know why we're there. Another level on which these photographs struck me as iconic of the larger story, and that's where the voices took over. They're worth much more than the photographs. To my mind, they tell you what you're seeing, and the photographs merely make an impression visually.
Well, there are several levels, I guess, responsibility and accountability, and your book is full of discussion about that. I mean, one of them is, you've been talking here about a national involvement, a national connection, but there's also the individual story of these individual people. So how should we think about, the terrible things were going on, are they responsible for this? Are soldiers doing these terrible things as individuals? How would you frame to us how to think about that?
I think about the story of Abu Ghraib and the story that the book tells as essentially a war story. In the old-fashioned sense, you get a group of young people and they're sent into a situation that's much vaster than they are, and they have a very narrow group view of it. If you want to take an image from digital photography, they're a pixel in a gigantic drama that involves people in Washington and people in caves in Afghanistan and history of centuries and so forth. And almost everybody's got hundreds of years of different history that they're dragging into this. They go into this and they're thinking about what to do. And they're sent to a prison that we learn a lot about as we talk to them, that it was in a combat zone. It was at the heart of the Sunni Triangle during the high part of the insurgency when it was in the Sunni Triangle in the fall of 2003. So it's being shelled constantly. It's a terrifying place. It's overcrowded with prisoners, 70, 80, 90% of whom may never have done anything related to the insurgency, but were simply rounded up in security sweeps and dumped here like in a concentration camp. They're terrified, they're untrained as guards, and they're suddenly put in a place where this is the high-value detainee military intelligence block. And so telling this story through their experiences as they come in and they look around and they say, Sarge, why are all these people naked? Sarge, why do they have panties on their head? Why are they in stress positions with their hands bound behind their backs, made to stand for hours? Why are we being made to keep them up all night? And they start meeting these military intelligence guys, CIA interrogators and contract interrogators who say, this is what you're supposed to do. It's to help break them. It's to prepare them for interrogation. It's to help extract information from them. They're somewhat clueless, and some of them are uneasy, and some of them are enthusiastic. as individuals, they respond differently, which is one of the things.
An important thing.
Very important, because a lot of the broader group psychology explanations overlook two things: individual variety and politics, policy. They come into a place where I also show there's this policy that's been put in place incrementally from the highest levels of Washington all the way down through the orders that are given to the interrogators in the prison as to how to go about what's allowed, use of dogs allowed, nudity, stress positions, sleep deprivation, all of this allowed, mandated, permitted. And they find themselves there. And I think that the question of individual responsibility, I don't want to say that they're not responsible, but one can have tremendous sympathy with them and a sense that they were pawns without simply exculpating them, and to understand that they were instruments of a great injustice and of crimes. And they were also the victims in being the only ones who were punished in the end. They are the victims of a great injustice. And so when you look at it, after Nuremberg, there was this notion that the argument that just following orders was no longer an acceptable argument. And it's been debunked. But that was, first of all, in reference to people pretty high up the chain.
Very high up. That was the top of
Hitler's henchmen.
the Nazi leadership.
That's right. Not the most low-level grunt in the field. And that person's job is to follow orders. Now, in the military, you're allowed, in fact, you're expected to disobey an illegal order. But try it. It's not so easy. Who do you go to? So there's something called command responsibility, and this is a fundamental principle of all well-run armies, which is everybody's responsible for the soldiers below him and accountable to the soldiers above him. So a mid-level officer makes sure everybody's shoes are shined, because if they're not, the guy above him gets on his case. By the same reason, it works all the way to torture. And so they kept being told, congratulations, you're doing a good job. This is what's expected of you. Don't worry about it. This is all right. And the people who told them that have never been held to account. So what we ended up with was, if you're in the pictures, you're in trouble, because the pictures became the substitute for the crimes. And we had a situation where we confused the act of taking the picture with the thing depicted.
But I mean, you accept the idea that this was bad behavior, they did it, they should be accountable. You're
Of course, to a certain degree. On the other hand, if you look at the history of the political prosecutions for policy crimes in former Yugoslavia and South Africa and Rwanda, it's always categorized. And the people who swung the machetes, the henchmen, the low-level people, are always held to a lower standard than the people at the highest level, the authors and masterminds of the crimes, even if those people never saw a drop of blood, much less spilled one by hand. So if they're guilty down below, then they should not be in jail alone. And I think you get a lot of anger and kind of a sense of injustice that can make them look like they don't get it. But they just feel they've been railroaded.
Well, so how high up do you see the level of accountability? I mean, who created the policies that got them to do that? They were asking their superiors who said, yeah, this is okay, who asked his superior.
Every link in the chain of the command right to the tippy top. I mean, this is, to my mind, this is the premise from which I approached the story. We know, and I sketch it all in in some detail.
Yeah, tell us more. I mean, I think that's important to the public in a way, that's an important part of your book, I see, is documenting how high up these different people were signing off on
Well, the stage was set. I mean, in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, the President and the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense and the Justice Department, then under Ashcroft, the President's White House counsel, who was then Gonzales, who later went to Justice, some of the men at Justice, the lawyers there in Addington, who was the legal counsel for the Vice President, set about seeking ways to dismantle the limitations and restrictions on intelligence gathering and interrogation in their prosecution of the War on Terror. And they studied the law, the Geneva Conventions and the international ban on torture, cruel, human, and degrading punishment. And they basically detected various weaknesses in definitions and other levels in those laws and said, they don't apply, let's scrap them, let's find loopholes within them. And they lawyered up and created a new set of rules. These rules were first seen in Afghanistan and primarily at Guantanamo Bay, where Rumsfeld signed off on the rules, allowing a lot of abusive treatments. Then they were brought to Abu Ghraib. And there's a really key moment that I found in trying to understand all of this, which is the moment of the president's mission accomplished speech, the famous May 1 speech. Right. He appears on the aircraft carrier.
Right. He gives the right out here, in San Diego.
That's right here in San Diego. He gives the thumbs up and grinning, a pose that soldiers at Abu Ghraib were mocked for using. And he says, mission accomplished. Well, he doesn't say it, it's on the banner. He says, this is the end of major combat in Iraq. Well, as we know, it was the beginning of the war almost. But what does he mean? On that same day in Afghanistan, Rumsfeld made the same declaration. What does this mean? In the Geneva Conventions, almost all of the protections that they extend to prisoners are based on a conventional war in which it's the warring armies of two states. Right. End of major combat meant Saddam's state is gone. Right. Anybody who's now fighting us becomes an illegal combatant. And when we capture them, they become security detainees. These labels turn out to have legal balloons attached to them, which create a whole new set of rules. And so, although it seemed like mission accomplishment was premature triumphalism, and it was mocked as such, and a campaign stunt, frankly, that year, it was, in fact, buried in it was a speech that created a new legal paradigm for Iraq, which said this whole war is illegal, the other side. Which
denied that this was a war to which Geneva Conventions could apply, because they apply to war.
Precisely. Right. And it said, this is now a anti-terrorist campaign, it's an anti-insurgent campaign, and they took a tiny little loophole in the Geneva Conventions which says that in the name of imperative military necessity, a occupier may seize people temporarily. And they used it to allow mass detention without charges in secret holding facilities without any system of release. And that created the climate and set the stage in which our soldiers, the MPs, found themselves becoming the poster boys for this policy.
So your argument is that the people at the very top, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz,
and all the way in between. Right. I don't think it's just sort of the very high layer and the very bottom layer. There's a kind of cowing, political cowing and corrupting of the military that takes place, where all along the chain, people kind of knuckle under. It's a bureaucracy. People see which way the wind's blowing. And it was no longer the Iraq War. It was the global war on terror in their minds, and anything was justified. And the soldiers were told this.
Right. So responsibility goes to the very top.
Absolutely.
Have things gotten any better? So that was several years ago. Are things any better today?
I think some things are probably better. I think that the scenes that we saw on camera would not be photographed, but also probably would not entirely be taking place. Not as such. But I would stress that many of those scenes were not strictly torture. Some of them were, but some of them were pictures of this kind of humiliation that was going on. The very worst stuff, the beatings, the scenes in which people were actually killed, happened off camera. And I suspect some of that stuff continues in secret prisons. We have task forces that are way outside any rules that are continuing to operate, manhunt teams, and so forth. Waterboarding has, in the interim, gone from being thought of as a kind of torture, which the government denied, to being an official policy of the United States of America, approved by both sides of the aisle in Congress, and approved by John McCain, who said the one consolation when he was being tortured in Vietnam was thinking, this is not what we do. That's what I mean by a national dishonor. And we're still holding tens of thousands of people in detention in Iraq in improved conditions over what you see in the photographs from Abu Ghraib. But just the other day in the New York Times, the general in charge of detention in Iraq said that he still thinks that over 60% of the people being held are held there for no good grounds and pose no security threat. That's a scandal, and it's very quiet. So I feel that we've been diverted from the central subject by the sheer sort of pornographic and bizarre and disgraceful aspect of these photographs to wishing that it was all inside the frame, and once we deal with what's in the frame, we're done with it.
So you think this is a debate that should continue, that your goal in a way in writing this is that we should be discussing what's permissible, what does terrorism, the fighting terrorism allow, not allow, we should be discussing. You regret that we haven't discussed this more.
I think that we should have a national debate because I actually have faith in a general popular view that nobody really wants to own this policy, that Americans do not want to say, yes, the image that we want to project into the world is the image of a nation that tortures as much as its enemies, that treats people poorly only minimally better than its enemies, that the standard by which we will measure ourselves in the war on terror is that we're not quite as bad as the terrorists. Right. That's too low a standard. I think that this debate could be very healthy, and I think that we can move away from it. There is a tradition here.
Right. Thank you for this very powerful message, Philip, and thank you for talking to us. There's a movie connected with this book, which I hope people will see and read the book. Thank you, Philip Gourevitch, for joining us today.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.